Racist cop kicks black female Navy SEAL in court. Instantly regrets her actions when she strikes back. In life, there are moments when we face decisions that are incredibly difficult. Decisions that not everyone is brave enough to make. Clara Mitchell, the former military officer with a shining career, once thought her life would always be smooth sailing. She worked for a major human rights organization celebrated worldwide for her tireless dedication. But everything changed when she accidentally uncovered a truth she never expected, a truth that even she couldn't believe. Have you ever found yourself standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything? A choice that could turn your entire world upside down. Clara had to face the hardest question of her life. Should she continue living in the shadows of deception, or should she confront the truth, even though it might destroy everything she's worked for? I'm sure you're curious about what happened next, and whether Clara could survive the storm ahead. This story isn't just about courage. It's about the decisions that many of us may face at some point in our lives. Before we dive in, tell us where you were tuning in from and what time it is where you are. We're curious to know just how far this story has spread and if you're a part of this journey with us. Clara Mitchell was only 28, yet her life had already been a journey full of intense trials and unwavering determination. A former military officer, she had spent years serving her country with honor and courage. Now she had found a new purpose, working for one of the largest human rights organizations in the world. To Clara, this was the dream. It was a place where her values aligned with her work, and she was able to fight for what was right. But like all stories, the path wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. Behind the polished offices, the glowing success stories, and the promises of justice, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until a quiet day at work, tucked behind layers of paperwork, that she stumbled across something that would shatter her sense of reality. There, hidden in a confidential report, were details that could ruin everything she had fought for. The organization she had trusted her sanctuary was involved in questionable, even unethical practices. How could the place she had sacrificed so much for be so complicit in the very injustices it claimed to fight against? This wasn't just a corporate oversight. It was a deliberate, carefully crafted cover-up. Clara felt the ground beneath her feet start to tremble as she read. The lines between right and wrong, truth and lie began to blur. Her mind raced. How could she confront this? Was it even possible to expose the truth without losing everything? Could a person truly find justice without destroying the foundation they built their life upon? And so Clara stood at a crossroads. She could continue down the path she'd known, keeping her head down, ignoring the truths that haunted her. Or she could risk everything, standing up against the very system she had once thought was built on honor. What would you do in Clara's shoes? Can we ever truly reconcile the truth with the world around us? Stay tuned, because what happens next is something you won't expect. Clara sat in her dimly lit office, scrolling through an endless stream of documents, emails, and reports. The work was tedious but necessary. She had always prided herself on doing what was right, on fighting for justice, no matter the cost. But that day, as she sifted through a stack of confidential files, she came across something that stopped her cold. A document buried deep within the layers of bureaucracy was a report on a deal between her organization and an unnamed company. Her heart raced as she began to read. The names of the companies involved weren't familiar at first, but as Clara continued, the details became clearer. This wasn't just a financial transaction. It was something much darker. The document outlined an under-the-table arrangement, bribes, hidden deals, and the worst of all, a direct connection to shady organizations known for their exploitation of vulnerable communities. Clara could hardly believe her eyes. Her mind spun, trying to process what she had just uncovered. How could this be? How could the organization she had fought so hard for be involved in such deceit? It was impossible to ignore. Clara had always believed in the integrity of the work she did and the mission she supported. But now, staring at these damning papers, the foundation she had built her career on was crumbling right before her eyes. She wasn't just looking at a few questionable transactions. She was looking at systemic corruption that had been hidden for years. Clara couldn't unsee what she had discovered. The information she held in her hands was explosive. The very organization she had dedicated her life to believing they were a force for good was complicit in the worst kind of corporate betrayal. Her first instinct was to confront her superiors. But as she sat there, the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't something she could just walk into a meeting and casually drop. This was far bigger than she had imagined. She thought back to the biggest corporate scandals in history. Names like Enron and Volkswagen came to mind, massive companies that had been brought to their knees because of corruption that had been hidden from the public for years. These scandals weren't just about money, they were about trust. People had placed their faith in these organizations, believing they were pillars of society, only to find that everything they thought they knew was a lie. But Clara knew the truth wasn't always a simple thing to reveal. Sometimes exposing the truth could bring down empires. Just like Enron's collapse in 2001, where executives manipulated financial reports and misled investors, or the Volkswagen scandal in 2015, when the company was caught cheating emissions tests, the truth, when revealed, had a way of unraveling everything. It was clear now the organization Clara had once thought of as a sanctuary, a place where her values aligned with her work, was no different from the very systems she had once stood against. The files she held were more than just paperwork. They were evidence of a massive betrayal. She sat there for what felt like hours staring at the documents in her hands. Clara was torn. She had always believed that the truth was the most powerful weapon anyone could wield. But now the weight of that truth seemed unbearable. If she exposed what she had found, she would be risking everything: her career, her reputation, and the very people she had worked alongside for years. Could she really do it? Could she be the one to tear down the house of cards they had built? The reality of the situation set in. The truth was out there waiting to be shared. But Clara couldn't escape the growing fear that once she spoke up, there would be no turning back. There was no guarantee that the fight for justice would lead to victory. Sometimes it just meant destruction. She thought about the people who had been in her position before. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, who had exposed government secrets and been vilified for it. They too had faced the choice: remain silent and protect their careers, or speak the truth and suffer the consequences. Clara knew that truth had the power to change the world, but she also understood that it could destroy everything in its path. And now, as she looked at the evidence in front of her, Clara was left with a terrifying question. Could the truth she held in her hands really be worth the cost of everything she had worked for? She had been fighting for justice all her life, but now it felt like the scales had tipped. She wasn't sure what to do, but one thing was clear: the decision she was about to make would not only shape her future, but the future of everyone around her. And so Clara was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the truth can be a weapon so powerful that it brings down everything you've worked to build. But the real question was she ready to use it? Clara sat in her office, the weight of the documents she had discovered still heavy in her hands. She had spent the last few days grappling with the reality of what she had uncovered. The temptation to confront her superiors head-on was overwhelming the urge to expose the truth and let the world see the corruption lurking beneath the surface of the organization. But as she sat there staring at the papers in front of her, a quiet voice in the back of her mind told her to wait. It wasn't fear that held her back. No, Clara had always been a fighter, always willing to stand up for what was right. But in this moment, she realized something important. Confrontation would only lead to chaos. It would be a fight that might take everything she had built and turn it to dust. No, there had to be another way, a way to make a change without burning the bridges she had worked so hard to cross. Clara made a decision. She chose silence. It wasn't the silence of submission, nor was it the silence of fear. It was a deliberate, thoughtful silence. Clara would not be dragged into the games of power and control. Instead, she would step back. She would observe. She would wait for the right moment to strike, not with words, but with actions. As Clara considered her choice, she thought of historical figures who had done the same. People like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, who had faced immense injustice, but chosen not to react with violence or anger. They had chosen the path of resistance through nonviolent means, standing firm in their beliefs while the world watched. Gandhi's philosophy of passive resistance had been revolutionary, changing the course of history in India without a single shot being fired. Mandela, too, had spent years in prison for his beliefs, but he never wavered. He knew that sometimes the most powerful resistance is the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout but still makes its presence felt. These were figures who understood the power of silence. They knew that sometimes the most effective way to challenge injustice was not through confrontation, but through persistence and resilience, and allowing time and truth to expose the lies. Clara saw herself in their struggle, and she realized that silence in her case might just be the most powerful tool she had at her disposal. In the following weeks, Clara adopted her new approach. She became a quiet observer, no longer a part of the daily games of office politics. She didn't attend meetings where decisions were made, and she stopped participating in the power struggles that had once consumed her. Instead, she spent her time gathering information, observing the cracks in the system that no one else seemed to notice. But Clara was not idle. She knew that in silence there was power. By stepping away, she allowed herself the freedom to see things from a different perspective. She no longer had to conform to the expectations of her colleagues or her superiors. She could now see the organization for what it truly was, not the polished version presented to the public, but the dark, flawed reality hidden behind the facade. There were moments when Clara questioned her decision. It wasn't easy to remain quiet when she knew the truth, when she saw injustice all around her. She wanted to shout to expose the corruption and the betrayal, but as the days passed, Clara understood the deeper truth of her choice. She wasn't surrendering. She was preparing. She was waiting for the moment when the truth would come crashing down on those who had been complicit in the deception. Her silence wasn't passive, it was strategic. She was giving the system a chance to reveal itself, to expose its flaws without her having to throw the first stone. Clara understood that the world didn't always need someone to speak the truth loudly. Sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones that are whispered through actions, not words. As she waited, Clara found herself reflecting on the lessons she had learned from history. She thought about how revolutions had often been sparked not by those who shouted the loudest, but by those who quietly resisted, who quietly exposed the cracks in the system. It was the calm, persistent actions of those who refused to give up that brought about real lasting change. Clara's silence became her weapon, her strength. And as time passed, she began to see the subtle shifts in the people around her. Her colleagues, once so caught up in the games of power, began to question their own roles. The cracks Clara had noticed in the system, they were starting to grow wider, and soon others began to see them too. It was then that Clara realized that sometimes silence is not the absence of action, it is the most powerful action of all. In choosing to step back and resist in her own way, Clara wasn't losing her fight for justice. She was strengthening it. She was allowing the truth to speak for itself. The lesson Clara had learned, and the one she wanted to share, was simple yet profound. In a world that often values noise and spectacle, sometimes the most powerful statement is made in silence. By refusing to play the game, Clara was creating a new kind of power, a power that came from within a power that no one could take away. And so, as she continued her work, as she continued to stay silent and wait, Clara knew that she was not just biding her time. She was making a statement that sometimes the greatest resistance comes not from the noise we make, but from the silence we choose to keep. Clara sat at her desk, the soft hum of the office surrounding her, but all she could feel was the heavy weight of her own thoughts. The silence that had once felt empowering, a space where she could gather her strength, now seemed suffocating. The days had passed slowly since her decision to stay quiet, to resist in her own way. But as she looked around the office, she couldn't ignore the constant tension that hung in the air. Her colleagues, the ones who had once been her trusted allies, were now beginning to notice her silence. They watched her closely, their whispers floating through the halls. They could sense that something had changed, but they didn't understand. To them, Clara's silence seemed like weakness. It felt like she was pulling away from the work they all did, like she was distancing herself from the cause they had all believed in. But Clara knew deep down that it was anything but weakness. Still, the pressure from those around her began to mount. Her boss, someone she had respected for years, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Clara, we need you. We need you to keep doing what you're doing. Don't let this little hiccup slow you down," he said, his voice calm but persuasive. He didn't understand. He couldn't see the truth that Clara had discovered. He wasn't willing to. For him, things were simple. There were deadlines to meet, projects to complete, and expectations to live up to. There was no room for questioning the system, and so he urged Clara to continue as if nothing had changed. "Just get back to work," he suggested, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "The organization is counting on you." Clara's stomach churned. The temptation to go back to the way things were, to slip back into the comfort of routine, was overwhelming. She had spent years building her career. She had worked tirelessly to get to where she was, and it was hard to imagine walking away from it all. But could she, in good conscience, continue to participate in something she knew was wrong? Could she ignore the truth that was now so clear, even though it threatened to destroy everything she had worked for? Her colleagues, too, had started to weigh in. Some had begun to gently suggest that Clara was being too hard on herself. "You can't change the system on your own," one of them said. "No one's perfect. We all have to make compromises." The word stung. Compromise. That was the word that Clara had been trying to avoid. She didn't want to be someone who compromised her integrity for the sake of convenience or success. But as the days passed, the pressure to return to the fold grew stronger. There were tasks to complete, projects to finalize, and Clara's silence was starting to stand out like a sore thumb. Her mind wavered. Could she just ignore the truth? Could she continue to work in an organization that was clearly involved in shady dealings, all in the name of success and progress? What if she could somehow convince herself that she was making a difference? That by staying she could help clean things up from the inside? Was that even possible? Clara knew that continuing with business as usual would be easier, at least in the short term. She could keep her job, continue to rise through the ranks, and avoid the uncomfortable reality that now haunted her. But at what cost? She thought about all the people who had been hurt by the organization's actions, the ones who had been exploited, deceived, and abandoned. How could she look at herself in the mirror if she chose to turn a blind eye? The internal struggle was tearing her apart. It felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the unknown, knowing that each step forward was a choice to either continue down the path she had always known or to take a leap into something entirely different. The fear of what might happen if she stood up, if she took action, weighed heavily on her. But the fear of what would happen if she didn't, if she stayed silent and complicit, was even greater. As Clara wrestled with her thoughts, she realized that this was the true test of her integrity. It wasn't just about discovering the truth, it was about deciding what to do with that truth. She had always been someone who stood up for what was right, but now she faced a choice that was far more difficult. Could she really walk away from a system she had dedicated her life to? Or was it more important to protect her soul and her own sense of morality, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for? And so Clara made her decision. She wouldn't allow herself to become numb to the injustice around her. She would not allow herself to continue in a system that was built on lies and corruption. But she also knew that the fight for truth wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't come without sacrifice. In the end, Clara realized that staying silent was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. Strength to resist the temptation to compromise, strength to resist the pressure from those around her, and strength to stand firm in her beliefs even when it felt like the world was pushing her to give in. The lesson Clara learned during this time was not just about standing up for what's right. It was about finding the courage to live with the consequences of that decision. Sometimes the hardest part of doing the right thing is not the choice itself, but the struggle to stay true to it when everything around you is telling you to let go. Clara's internal conflict was far from over, but with each passing day she grew stronger. And as she moved forward, she realized that this struggle was the very thing that would shape her into the person she needed to become. Clara stood in front of her office window looking out at the city skyline. The sun had just begun to set, casting a soft orange glow over the buildings. It was a beautiful view, one that she had admired many times before. But today it felt different. Today it felt empty. She had spent countless nights pondering the same question. What now? The weight of the decision before her seemed almost unbearable. Should she stay? Should she continue to work in an organization that she had once believed in? Or should she walk away, leaving behind everything she had worked so hard for to preserve her integrity? The truth, that undeniable truth, had been exposed, and now Clara was left to confront it head on. The system she had once supported, the organization she had given her heart and soul to, was far from the noble cause she had believed it to be. She had seen the corruption, the manipulation, and the lies. The people she had once trusted had failed her, and now she was faced with a decision that could change the course of her life forever. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. It was her boss, a voice that she had grown to respect over the years. But today, hearing his name on the screen felt different. His voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost reassuring, but Clara could sense the underlying pressure. Clara, we need you. You've been with us for a long time. We need you to stay focused. Let's move forward, put everything behind us, and keep pushing ahead. It was the same line he had used countless times before, but this time Clara couldn't ignore the reality of what was being asked of her. They wanted her to move on, to forget the truth, to keep working as though nothing had changed. The temptation to continue to not rock the boat was strong, but Clara knew deep down that she couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It wasn't about the salary or the position. It was about something much deeper, her integrity, her values. And with each passing day, that inner conflict grew louder. How could she continue to work for an organization that was clearly involved in unethical practices? How could she look at herself in the mirror every morning, knowing she was complicit in something she couldn't condone? Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She thought back to the countless moments when she had told herself that things would get better, that she could fix it from the inside. But as time went on, the lies became harder to ignore, the injustices more difficult to rationalize. She had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, so determined to prove herself, that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. And now it felt as if her entire world was crashing down. But then there was the other side of the equation, the side that asked her what would happen if you walked away. If she left, it would be a monumental risk. She would lose everything she had worked for, the career, the accolades, the status. She would be stepping into the unknown, leaving behind the security of a well-established position. It was a leap into uncertainty, a choice that could cost her more than just a job. It could cost her everything she had ever known. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Staying was no longer an option. She couldn't keep living this double life, pretending that everything was fine when she knew the truth. The cost of staying in this environment where lies were the currency of success was too great. She had already sacrificed too much of her own soul to keep up appearances. Clara sat back down at her desk and took a long, steadying breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing what her life could look like without this weight. She imagined herself walking away from the toxic environment, from the people who had turned a blind eye to the truth. She imagined waking up in the morning without the cloud of guilt hanging over her. It felt like a small victory, like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating in silence. But even as she pictured her future, Clara knew that the decision wasn't going to be easy. Leaving the organization, leaving behind the career she had spent years building, was an act of bravery. It was a step into the unknown, but it was also a step toward freedom. Freedom from the lies, from the manipulation, and from the compromises that had slowly eroded her sense of self. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed the number of her boss. Her heart raced as the line rang. The moment had arrived, the moment that would change everything. When he answered, Clara took a deep breath and spoke the words that had been building up inside her for so long. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm leaving." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It felt like time had stopped. She could almost hear the shock in his voice as he tried to process what she had just said. But for Clara, the silence was a confirmation. It was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when integrity finally met reality. The moment when she chose to stand up for what she believed in, no matter the cost. And as she hung up the phone, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The decision was made. It was done. She had chosen to walk away from a life that no longer aligned with her values. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. Clara Mitchell was no longer willing to sacrifice her integrity for the sake of success. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't the one that requires the most effort. It's the one that demands the most courage. Clara had made her decision, and the weight of it had not left her since. Leaving the organization had felt like cutting the ties that bound her to a life of deceit. But what she hadn't prepared for was the aftermath. The truth, while freeing in many ways, came at a high cost. Though she was no longer part of the organization, the shadows of her past continued to follow her. It wasn't just the betrayal and corruption that haunted her, but the society's judgment. Clara quickly realized that in a world where appearances meant everything, the price of standing up for what was right wasn't just measured in the sacrifices she made, it was measured in how others would now see her. Her phone rang one evening as she sat on her couch staring blankly at the television. It was a number she didn't recognize, but there was something about the call that made her stomach churn. She answered, her voice hesitant. "Clara, we need to talk." It was Jennifer, a former colleague from the organization. Clara felt her heart drop as Jennifer's voice came through the phone. What followed was not the friendly chat she had hoped for, but something far more chilling. "You've made a huge mistake." Jennifer said the words sharp, almost bitter. "You've turned your back on everything we worked for, everything we believed in." Clara felt a pang of guilt, but she held her ground. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to back down now. "It wasn't a mistake," Clara replied, her voice steady but heavy. "I had to do what was right." But Jennifer's words cut through her defenses, and the barrage of criticism didn't stop there. It spread like wildfire across social circles and networks she had once been a part of. Clara found herself suddenly labeled as a traitor, a turncoat. People she had once called friends started to distance themselves, their words laced with venom. She didn't belong, they whispered behind her back, as if her decision to leave had betrayed some unspoken rule. Her decision to stand up for integrity had made her a target in a society that didn't reward honesty as much as it rewarded conformity. It didn't take long before Clara became the subject of online hate, her name attached to every article that painted her in a negative light. The media, always eager for a scandal, picked up the story. Her face, once admired and respected, was now plastered across social media in the context of a traitor, a whistleblower who couldn't handle the pressure. Clara had never imagined how deeply cancel culture could affect a person. She had read about it, heard the stories of celebrities, politicians, and other public figures who had fallen from grace, but she never thought it would touch her. Yet there she was, experiencing firsthand the brutal side of this new social reality. Her past achievements, her reputation, all seemed irrelevant now, overshadowed by her decision to expose the truth. It was not just the public who turned their back on Clara. It was people who once called her a friend, a trusted colleague. They labeled her as weak, as someone who couldn't handle the pressure, or worse, as a person who had turned her back on everything she stood for. The very organization that had once celebrated her for her loyalty now vilified her. She was being erased not just from the organization, but from the collective memory of those who had once known her. The backlash was crushing. The isolation felt suffocating. Clara didn't know who to trust anymore. The world seemed to have changed overnight, and she felt as though she was being punished for doing the right thing. She questioned herself in the silence of her apartment, doubting whether she had made the right decision. Was it worth it? Was it worth losing everything, including the people who had once stood by her? But then Clara realized something crucial. The cost of standing up for the truth. The truth wasn't just about losing friends or being ostracized. It was about reclaiming her own sense of self. It was about standing firm in her beliefs, regardless of how much the world tried to tear her down. And in that moment of reflection, Clara found the courage to keep going. She thought about the public figures who had faced similar challenges. Celebrities whose careers were destroyed after a single mistake, or political figures who were labeled corrupt after a scandal erupted. There was the story of an actor whose past tweets were resurrected and used against them, a political leader whose decisions were scrutinized in the harshest light, and countless others who had been canceled by the public for actions taken in their past. In those stories, Clara saw a mirror of her own. These individuals had faced the wrath of society for their mistakes, yet many had come out on the other side stronger, more resolute. The truth, Clara realized, was a double-edged sword. It had freed her, yes, but it had also painted a target on her back. And the price of that truth was steep. In a world that often valued conformity over honesty, those who spoke out were often the ones who were silenced. But Clara knew deep down that the truth was worth it. It was a painful lesson to learn, but it was one that had changed her forever. In the end, standing up for the truth was never about winning the approval of others. It was about being true to herself, even if it meant standing alone. The world would eventually forget the details of the story, the headlines would fade, and the whispers would die down. But Clara would always remember the cost of standing up for what was right. And no matter how much the world tried to cancel her, it could never erase the strength she had found within herself. As she moved forward, Clara realized that the real lesson wasn't in avoiding the backlash. It was in understanding that integrity, though it may cost you dearly in the short term, would always give you something far more valuable in the long run: peace. Peace with yourself and peace in knowing that you stood up when it mattered most. And for Clara, that peace was enough. Clara had chosen a path that many would call unconventional, but for her, it was the only one that made sense. The weight of the truth she had uncovered had shaken her to the core, yet she didn't feel the need to shout it from the rooftops. In a world where opinions and words were often loud and brash, Clara realized that her silence could speak volumes. She didn't need to voice her outrage or frustration. Instead, she believed that her actions would do the talking for her. There is a quiet power in restraint, the kind of power that doesn't seek validation from others, but instead emanates from within. Clara chose not to publicly confront those who had wronged her, nor did she feel the need to expose the truth to the world in a dramatic fashion. She understood that sometimes the most profound messages come not through spoken words, but through the quiet strength of one's actions. It wasn't that Clara was passive or indifferent, far from it. Her silence was a form of resistance, a methodical act of standing firm in her truth without the need for spectacle. It was an expression of her unwavering belief that the truth in all its rawness could be communicated far more effectively through what she did rather than what she said. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. In many ways, Clara's journey echoed that of others who had chosen a similar path. Think of Greta Thunberg, whose silence was her way of showing the world how urgent climate change really was. Greta didn't need to shout. She needed only to stand quiet and resolute, holding her signs and showing up. That act of stillness, the dedication to her cause, made the world listen. It wasn't the shouting that created the movement. It was the silent, constant action behind her every step. Her actions were a testament to the power of living out your truth, even when the world demanded something louder, something flashier. Similarly, Edward Snowden, a name now synonymous with whistleblowing, chose silence too, at least at first. He didn't approach the media with a megaphone. Instead, he made calculated decisions to share the information that would eventually expose the surveillance state, but his actions were quiet and deliberate. Snowden didn't run to the cameras. He ran to the truth, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. These figures like Clara understood that silence could be louder than words. They knew that action, especially when done with integrity and purpose, carries a weight that is immeasurable. Clara, in her own way, was doing the same thing. By walking away from a corrupt system, she was making a powerful statement. She didn't need to scream, to point fingers, or to publicize her discovery. The sheer act of leaving, of refusing to participate in the deception, any longer sent a message that was impossible to ignore. As Clara moved forward, she noticed something remarkable. Slowly but surely, others began to take notice. Her former colleagues, those who once turned a blind eye, began to question things in a way they hadn't before. They started to look at the organization through a new lens, asking themselves if they too were complicit in the very corruption they had been a part of. The quiet strength Clara had demonstrated had begun to ripple outward, influencing those around her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her silence wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a powerful catalyst for change. The idea that action can speak louder than words is not a new one, but it is one that is often overlooked in a society that tends to prioritize noise over substance. Clara's journey was a reminder that sometimes it's not the loudest voice that has the most impact, but the quietest one that carries the deepest meaning. In a world where we are bombarded by endless chatter and distractions, it can be easy to forget that sometimes the strongest statement is the one that is never spoken at all. This concept of silent strength is something that has been demonstrated throughout history in both subtle and profound ways. It is a lesson that goes beyond any single individual or moment. It's about understanding that change doesn't always have to come with fireworks and applause. Sometimes it starts with one person standing quietly in their truth, letting their actions create ripples that spread far beyond what they could ever imagine. Clara knew that her decision to stay silent wasn't just for her own peace of mind, it was for those who came after her. She had hoped, even in her darkest moments, that her choice would inspire others to think critically, to question, and to seek the truth in their own lives. Her hope was that her actions would serve as a beacon, guiding others who felt trapped in systems of corruption or injustice to realize that they too could make a difference without ever having to raise their voice. There is an undeniable power in action, a power that can transcend words. Clara had proven that. And just like Greta, just like Snowden, she had shown that sometimes it is the quiet moments, the unsung decisions, and the simple acts of standing firm in one's truth that make the most significant impact. When words fail, actions speak. So as Clara continued on her path, she didn't need to look back for approval or validation. She knew that the world might never fully understand her choice, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen integrity, chosen action, and chosen silence as her weapon against injustice. In the end, Clara's story would not be remembered for the words she spoke, but for the strength she carried, the actions she took, and the lasting impact she made by simply choosing to stay silent when the world demanded her to speak. As time went on, Clara began to notice something remarkable. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the way people around her, especially her former colleagues, began to view the organization they all once served. The truth she had quietly revealed, though initially buried under the weight of silence, was beginning to take root in the minds of those who had once been blind to it. It wasn't just the people who had directly worked with her, but others in the community who were starting to ask questions, who were starting to see the cracks in the foundation of the system they had always trusted. The change was slow at first. Clara didn't expect it to happen overnight, and she certainly didn't expect any immediate acknowledgement of the role she had played in this shift. But with each passing day, she saw more and more people around her waking up to the truth. Her actions, quiet and unspoken, had sparked something much bigger than she had anticipated. It wasn't just her who was affected by this newfound awareness. It was the whole system, the whole community, that was beginning to question its own integrity. It wasn't unlike the way ripples spread across a pond. The smallest stone cast into the water doesn't just sink, it sends out concentric circles that grow wider and wider, reaching places far beyond where the stone landed. And in this case, Clara's stone had been dropped long ago, and now those ripples were beginning to spread. It was almost as if the truth had set off a chain reaction, gradually changing the way people thought about right and wrong, about power and corruption, about the systems that govern our lives. One of the most profound lessons Clara learned was that change doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that can be forced or rushed. But when it does start, when the smallest act of courage or integrity sparks a shift, it can grow into something much bigger than anyone could have ever imagined. And that was exactly what Clara had begun to witness. Slowly, the people around her were changing. They were beginning to see what she had seen all along. They were starting to question, to doubt, and ultimately to take action themselves. It was a lesson that had played out time and time again throughout history. Social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too had proven that significant change doesn't always come from grand gestures or dramatic moments. Instead, it starts with individuals like Clara who take a stand, even if that stand is quiet and subtle. These movements didn't erupt overnight. They began with small individual acts of courage. A single voice raised against injustice, followed by another and another, until the voices grew loud enough to demand change. And that's what happened with Clara. Her quiet decision to step away from a corrupt system wasn't just an individual choice, it became a catalyst for others to see things differently, to question their own complicity, and ultimately to push for change in their own lives and in the systems they were a part of. The parallels between Clara's story and these larger movements were unmistakable. In both cases, it was the courage of individuals to act even quietly that eventually led to a collective awakening. The power of these movements wasn't found in the noise, but in the quiet, consistent actions of those who dared to stand for what was right. Just as Black Lives Matter has challenged us to reconsider our ideas about race and justice, and how Me Too has called attention to sexual harassment and assault, Clara's actions had sparked a similar shift, a new way of thinking about integrity, truth, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Clara began to realize that the most powerful change often comes from within. She had once been part of a system that seemed impossible to change. But by choosing to act according to her values, even in silence, she had started a process of transformation that was far beyond her control. It was now up to others to continue this work, to continue questioning, to continue pushing for change in their own ways. She had started the spark, and now it was up to the community to fan those flames into something more. It was in this moment that Clara understood one of the most profound truths of her journey. Change, while often slow and painstaking, has the potential to snowball. The smallest action, when it aligns with a deep truth, can create waves that spread far beyond what we could ever predict. And just like the movements that had changed the world before her, Clara's decision to stand in her truth, to make a choice based on integrity rather than self-interest, had begun to ripple outward, touching lives and changing hearts in ways she never expected. The lesson Clara had learned was clear. Change is never immediate, but it's always possible. And the most profound change often comes from the simplest actions, the quietest acts of courage. It's not the grand speeches or the loud protests that create lasting change. It's the small, consistent choices made by individuals who refuse to turn a blind eye, who refuse to accept the status quo, and who choose to act even when the world around them remains silent. Clara's story became a testament to the idea that true social change starts from within, and that the most powerful movements are often those that are born out of quiet, deliberate acts of resistance. Her journey wasn't just about her own personal growth. It was about the ripple effect that can occur when one person decides to live according to their values no matter the cost. And as Clara stood back and watched the community around her begin to change, she knew that her decision to act, her decision to take a stand quietly and resolutely, had done something far greater than she could have imagined. She had sparked a movement, one that would continue long after she was gone, as others picked up the torch and carried it forward. Because in the end, it's the ripples that matter. It's the small actions that create the waves that can change the world. And Clara had done just that. Clara had always believed that her life's purpose was rooted in truth. She fought for what was right, even when it meant going against the current, even when it felt like the world was pushing her back into the shadows. But now, having made her mark, she found herself at a crossroads. The same organizations that once dismissed her were now offering her the spotlight. They wanted her to be their symbol, their hero, her story packaged and sold to the highest bidder. To be used as a figurehead for causes that seemed to be less about the truth and more about the fame that could be garnered from her experiences. But Clara wasn't interested in that kind of fame. She wasn't looking for validation from the world or a pat on the back. She had walked away from a system that had corrupted her sense of purpose, and now she wasn't about to return to another system that could corrupt her just as easily. She was tired of fighting battles on someone else's terms. The truth she had uncovered, the actions she had taken, were hers alone. They were not meant to be manipulated or commercialized. So Clara made a choice that surprised many who had been watching her journey unfold. She turned down all the offers that came her way, choosing instead to live a quiet, humble life. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. The public recognition, the articles, the documentaries, they all seemed trivial compared to the peace she now craved. Clara sought a life that wasn't defined by accolades or the opinions of others. She wanted to live simply without the noise of the world constantly trying to shape her narrative. It wasn't an easy decision. Fame, after all, can be intoxicating. The validation, the applause, the chance to be remembered in history, it's easy to be seduced by the idea of leaving a legacy. But Clara understood that true peace didn't come from the outside world. It came from within. She had seen firsthand the cost of chasing after the approval of others. It often meant losing oneself in the process, losing sight of what truly mattered. She thought about the years she spent in the corporate world, surrounded by people who were driven by power and prestige, people who would sacrifice anything for success. She saw them climbing higher and higher on the corporate ladder, always looking for the next opportunity to shine, but never really finding contentment. They were constantly chasing in after something they could never quite catch validation from a system that was built on lies. Clara didn't want to live like that anymore. She didn't need to be famous to prove her worth. What she had learned through her struggles, through her journey, was that peace of mind was worth more than any award or recognition. And she was willing to trade the spotlight for the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what was right, even if no one else ever noticed. In this choice, Clara discovered a profound truth. Personal peace is often the greatest reward we can achieve, even if it comes without the applause of the world. She had lived through the chaos of public life and had seen the darkness behind the glittering facade. Now she wanted nothing more than to find a simple, quiet existence, free from the pressure of external expectations. This decision, however, was not just about seeking solitude or retreating from the world. It was about reclaiming her autonomy, her right to define her own life on her own terms. By stepping away from the limelight, Clara was in essence taking back control over her story. She didn't need others to tell her what her life should look like. She knew that true success wasn't measured by how many people admired her, but by how content she was with herself. She was living her truth not for the approval of others, but for herself. And in this quiet, uncelebrated life, Clara found a sense of freedom she had never known before. It was a life where she could continue to stand for truth, where she could continue to advocate for justice, but without the burden of being a public figure. Her actions, her choices would speak for themselves, and that was enough. Through this journey, Clara came to realize that peace is not something that can be bought or earned through fame. It is something that comes when we let go of the need for validation and embrace the quiet strength that comes from living authentically. She had done the hard work of standing up for what was right, and now she could rest in the knowledge that she had made the right choices regardless of how the world saw her. In the end, Clara's story isn't just about the struggles she faced or the truth she uncovered. It's about finding a way to live authentically in a world that often values fame and success above all else. It's about knowing when to step back, when to embrace the peace that comes from within, and understanding that sometimes the greatest reward is simply being at peace with yourself. Clara's story is a reminder to us all that peace, self-contentment, and authenticity are the truest forms of success. Fame and glory may come and go, but the quiet satisfaction of living a life true to one's values will always remain. And in the end, that is the most important thing of all. Clara's journey had come full circle, from the chaos of corporate life to the quiet sanctuary she had built for herself. Clara had become something more than a hero. She was a symbol of quiet strength, showing a new generation that real change doesn't always have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest acts of resistance, and sometimes the strongest people are those who stand silently in the face of adversity. Clara's story is a testament to the power of one person standing firm in their values, refusing to compromise their integrity even when it means walking away from everything. It's easy to get lost in the noise of the world, to believe that only the loudest voices are heard. But Clara showed us that sometimes the most profound impact comes from the quietest actions. Her silence was not weakness, but the embodiment of inner strength, a force that could not be silenced. Her decision to step away from the spotlight, to reject the allure of fame and recognition, was not a retreat. It was a deliberate choice to create change from the inside out, to stand tall in her truth without the need for validation. And through her actions, Clara had proven something powerful, that true change doesn't require a microphone. It simply requires someone willing to take a stand. As the years go by, Clara's story will continue to inspire. It's a story about holding on to one's principles, about resisting the pressure to conform, and about understanding that the loudest voices aren't always the ones that matter most. It's a story that speaks to the core of who we are as individuals and reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes start from within, and that one person can make all the difference. And as Clara's story comes to a close, let us remember the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions start in silence. So if you've been inspired by Clara's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you'll want to be part of more stories like this. The world is changing, and it starts with the quiet ones.